3 bullets, 3 targets, 3 seconds that changed everything. The woman they called too soft for security detail had just saved the lives of America's most decorated military commanders. But how she got there and what happened next will leave you questioning everything you think you know about strength, courage, and the price of being underestimated. The rain drummed against the windows of the Pentagon's executive security briefing room, like an impatient visitor demanding entry. Inside, fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the faces of 12 men who had spent their careers measuring threats in calibers and body counts. They sat around a polished conference table that had witnessed countless discussions about national security, but today's agenda carried an unusual tension. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Detective Rebecca Chun stood outside the door, her fingers wrapped around a manila folder that contained her reassignment papers. At 32, she had spent 8 years working domestic violence cases in Baltimore's roughest precincts, building a reputation for patience and precision that had earned her commendations from grateful families and frustrated criminals in equal measure. Her slight frame, standing barely 5'4" in regulation heels, carried the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to read danger in a glance, a gesture, a change in breathing pattern. The folder felt heavier than it should have. Inside were psychological evaluations, marksmanship scores, and background checks that painted the picture of an exemplary law enforcement officer. What it didn't contain was any explanation for why someone with her profile had been selected for the most elite protection detail in the United States military. Through the reinforced glass, she could see the men inside gesturing with the animated frustration of people discovering their carefully laid plans had been disrupted. Colonel David Martinez, the detail commander, ran his hands through graying hair that spoke of 2 decades spent in places where the wrong decision meant body bags. His weathered face bore the map of a career spent in Afghanistan, Iraq, and a dozen other locations that existed only in classified reports. Beside him sat Lieutenant Colonel James Peterson, a former Navy SEAL whose reputation for aggressive tactics had made him legendary among his peers and notorious among his enemies. His pale eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had learned to see the world in terms of threats neutralized and objectives achieved. When he smiled, which was rarely, it never reached those eyes. Master Sergeant Robert Williams occupied the chair closest to the window, his massive frame testament to years of military conditioning. Former Delta Force, he had trained protection details for heads of state and corporate executives, whose enemies counted their wealth and oil reserves and territorial disputes. His hands, scarred from close-quarters combat in 3 different continents, drummed silently on the table as he studied the personnel files spread before him. The other 9 men represented the cream of military and law enforcement elite. Former Rangers, Green Berets, FBI tactical specialists, Secret Service veterans who had taken bullets for presidents and lived to joke about it over beers they couldn't afford on government salaries. Each had been handpicked for Operation Guardian Shield, the code name for what the Pentagon publicly described as enhanced executive protection protocols. What the public didn't know was that Guardian Shield had been born from intelligence chatter, suggesting a coordinated attack on American military leadership. 3 generals, each representing a different branch of service, each carrying knowledge that could reshape global military strategy, had been marked for elimination by an enemy whose identity remained frustratingly elusive. General Patricia Hayes commanded the Army's most advanced cyber warfare division, overseeing operations that existed in the shadowy intersection of silicon and steel. Her work had prevented 17 documented attacks on American infrastructure, saved countless civilian lives, and earned her a target designation from terrorist organizations across 4 continents. General Marcus Thompson led the Air Force's classified aerospace development program, shepherding projects that wouldn't see public acknowledgement for another decade. His fingerprints were on technologies that had revolutionized modern warfare, and his elimination would set back American air superiority by years that couldn't be recovered. General Sarah Rodriguez commanded Marine Special Operations units whose missions were so classified that their existence was denied by official channels. Her tactical innovations had saved American lives in conflicts the public would never hear about, in places that didn't appear on any map. The intelligence suggested that all three would be targeted during the upcoming Joint Chiefs Summit, a quarterly gathering that brought together military leadership from across the armed services. Traditional security protocols called for separate protection details, compartmentalized coverage that had worked flawlessly for 15 years. But the intercepted communications indicated something different this time. The enemy knew those protocols, had studied them, planned around them. The response required innovation, adaptation, thinking that existed outside conventional military doctrine. Colonel Martinez had assembled his team using criteria that prioritized experience, aggression, and the kind of tactical thinking that emerged from live combat situations. These men had faced down insurgents, cartels, and international terrorists. They understood violence as a language spoken in muzzle flashes and impact craters, which made Rebecca's assignment all the more puzzling. Her personnel file read like a character study in restraint. 8 years of domestic violence cases had taught her to de-escalate situations where traditional police tactics failed spectacularly. She specialized in protecting victims whose lives depended on someone understanding that the real threat often wore a familiar face and spoke in loving tones until the moment it didn't. Her marksmanship scores were exemplary, her psychological evaluations pristine, her arrest record clean enough to serve as a textbook example. But nothing in her background suggested the kind of hardcore tactical experience that typically earned assignment to executive protection details. The door opened with the sharp authority of someone accustomed to command. Martinez's voice carried the weight of rank and the edge of barely controlled frustration. "Detective Chun, please come in." Rebecca stepped into the room with the measured pace of someone who had learned that quick movements could trigger dangerous responses. She nodded respectfully to the assembled men, noting how their eyes tracked her movement, cataloged her appearance, filed away impressions that would shape their interactions for weeks to come. "Gentlemen," Martinez said, his tone suggesting he was about to deliver news that would be received about as enthusiastically as a cancer diagnosis. "Meet your new team member." The silence that followed could have been measured in geological ages. Peterson's pale eyes narrowed as he studied Rebecca like a lab specimen that had somehow crawled out of its cage. Williams's scarred hands stopped their drumming, freezing, in a position that suggested his fingers were calculating the distance to weapons that weren't there. "Sir," Peterson's voice carried the diplomatic courtesy that barely concealed profound skepticism. "Perhaps there's been some administrative error. This is Executive Protection Detail Alpha. We're responsible for safeguarding 3 of the military's most valuable assets during a high-threat conference." "No error, Lieutenant Colonel. Detective Chun has been assigned to this detail by direct order of the Joint Chiefs. Her specialized background in threat assessment and victim protection makes her uniquely qualified for this assignment." Rebecca recognized the tone. It was the same careful neutrality Martinez had probably used when explaining to combat veterans why they needed to follow rules of engagement, written by people who had never heard bullets whistle past their ears. Diplomatic language that translated roughly to, "I don't like this either, but orders are orders." "With respect, sir," Williams's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Threat assessment in domestic situations doesn't translate to executive protection." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. These aren't angry husbands we're dealing with. These are professional killers with military training and international resources. Detective Chun, Martinez continued, as if Williams hadn't spoken, has demonstrated exceptional situational awareness, tactical planning, and crisis management under extreme pressure. Her psychological profile indicates unusual resilience and adaptability. Rebecca listened to the conversation about her qualifications with the detached interest of someone watching a movie about their own life. She understood the dynamic at work. These men had earned their positions through documented violence, proven effectiveness in situations where failure meant death. Her resume read like a social worker's training manual by comparison. What's her tactical experience? Asked Captain Michael Foster, former FBI hostage rescue team, his weathered face showing the kind of skepticism that emerged from watching overconfident rookies make fatal mistakes. Classified, Martinez replied, which was technically true. Since Rebecca's most relevant experience wasn't contained in any file these men would ever see. The truth was more complicated than her official record suggested. 3 years earlier, Rebecca had been working a domestic violence case that had exploded into something resembling urban warfare. The suspect, Marcus Vale, had been a former military contractor whose psychological break had manifested as a methodical campaign against his ex-wife and her family. Vale had planned his attack with military precision, using surveillance techniques and tactical equipment that turned a simple restraining order violation into a siege that lasted 14 hours. He had taken his ex-wife's family hostage in their suburban home, transforming a quiet residential street into a battlefield that demanded responses no police academy had taught. Rebecca had been the primary negotiator, but when Vale's psychological deterioration reached the point where communication became impossible, she had found herself in the position of having to act with lethal force to protect innocent lives. The official report described her actions in the sanitized language of justified force, but the classified addendum told a different story. She had neutralized Vale with a single shot fired at a distance of 180 yards through a basement window, partially obscured by furniture, while he held a knife to a 6-year-old girl's throat. The shot had required compensation for wind drift, bullet drop, and the possibility that her target might move at the crucial moment. She had made the shot with a borrowed rifle she had never fired before, under stress conditions that would have challenged a military sniper. The incident had earned her commendations and the kind of quiet attention that came from federal agencies who specialized in recruiting people with unusual skill sets. But it had also taught her the weight that came with taking a life, even when that life belonged to someone who had forfeited their right to mercy. "Gentlemen," Martinez said, closing the discussion with the finality of someone who had delivered orders to men who might not survive to complain about them. "Detective Chun is part of this team. Our mission parameters remain unchanged. Guardian Shield launches in 72 hours. Peterson's smile was the kind that might have been considered friendly if you didn't notice how it failed to reach his eyes. "Of course, sir. We'll make sure Detective Chen receives all the support she needs to integrate with the team." Rebecca recognized the tone. It was the same carefully neutral voice she had heard from police colleagues who resented her assignments, her methods, her unwillingness to embrace the casual brutality that some officers considered necessary for effective law enforcement. Smile that promised a learning experience designed more for humiliation than education. The briefing continued with tactical discussions that revealed the scope of what they were facing. Intelligence indicated that the attack would come during the summit's opening ceremony, when all 3 generals would be present in the same location for the first time in 6 months. The venue, the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, offered multiple sight lines, entry points, and escape routes that made traditional security protocols inadequate. "The threat assessment indicates professional capability," Martinez explained, manipulating a laser pointer that highlighted potential sniper positions, vehicle approach routes, and structural vulnerabilities. military training, advanced equipment, and detailed knowledge of our standard protection procedures. Rebecca studied the diagrams with the focused attention. She had learned to apply to crime scenes where the smallest detail might mean the difference between a solved case and a grieving family. The building's architecture created natural bottlenecks that could channel people into killing zones, but it also offered opportunities for defensive positioning that traditional security thinking might overlook. What about interior protection? She asked, her first contribution to the tactical discussion. Standard formation, Williams replied with the patience typically reserved for explaining elementary concepts to slow children. Diamond pattern, primary protectees in the center, armed escorts at cardinal points. 2 backup teams for emergency. Extraction. Has anyone considered that the standard formation might be exactly what they're planning for? The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Peterson's pale eyes focused on Rebecca with the kind of attention a hawk might give a mouse that had just suggested improvements to hunting techniques. "Detective," he said with exaggerated courtesy, "these formations have been tested in live combat situations. They've protected presidents, prime ministers, and corporate executives whose enemies have unlimited resources and professional training. They work because they've been refined through actual experience." "I'm sure they do," Rebecca replied, maintaining the even tone that had served her well when dealing with suspects who viewed courtesy as weakness. "But if the intelligence is accurate, we're facing an enemy who knows these formations, has studied them, planned around them. Maybe effectiveness requires adaptation." "Adaptation," Williams repeated, as if testing the word for hidden meanings. "You've been on executive protection details before, Detective." "No, but I've protected people whose lives depended on staying ahead of someone who knew their routines, their habits, their responses to threat. Sometimes the best protection comes from doing what your enemy doesn't expect." The silence that followed was broken only by the rain continuing its assault on the windows. Rebecca could feel the weight of their judgment, the careful assessment that would determine whether she was treated as a colleague or tolerated as an unwelcome burden. Martinez cleared his throat with the authority of someone redirecting a discussion that had veered into unproductive territory. "We'll review all tactical options during tomorrow's planning session. Right now, let's focus on intelligence briefings and threat assessment." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of classified information, threat matrices, and operational parameters that painted a picture of an enemy whose capabilities remained frustratingly undefined. The intelligence came from sources whose reliability couldn't be questioned, but whose information raised more questions than it answered. Phone intercepts suggested coordination between domestic and international elements, but the actual participants remained shadowy figures whose identities existed only in code names and fragmented communications. Financial tracking indicated significant resources flowing toward an operation scheduled for the summit dates, but the money trail disappeared into offshore accounts and shell companies that might take months to unravel. What emerged was a portrait of an enemy who understood American security protocols well enough to plan around them, who possessed resources sufficient to mount a complex operation, and whose motivations remained unclear enough to make defensive planning exponentially more difficult. "Questions?" Martinez asked as the briefing concluded. Rebecca raised her hand with the careful timing of someone who had learned that the wrong question at the wrong moment could derail an entire investigation. "Do we know why these specific targets? Why these 3 generals? Why now?" "They're combined. Knowledge represents critical advantages in cyber warfare, aerospace development, and special operations," Peterson replied. "Eliminating them would set back American military capabilities by years." "But why eliminate them? Why not recruitment, blackmail, extraction for interrogation? Dead generals can't provide ongoing intelligence." Williams leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone watching a child ask why the sky wasn't purple. "Sometimes, Detective, the goal is simply to remove the threat they represent." Not every enemy wants information. Sometimes they just want Americans to stop breathing. Rebecca nodded, accepting the explanation while filing away her doubts. Her experience with domestic violence cases had taught her that the most dangerous perpetrators were those whose motivations remained unclear until the moment they acted. The rational ones could be predicted, negotiated with, sometimes even deterred. It was the irrational ones who kept her awake at night. "Dismissed," Martinez announced. 0700 tomorrow for tactical rehearsal. Detective Chun, please remain behind. The other men filed out with the disciplined movement of people accustomed to following orders they might not agree with. Rebecca caught glimpses of their expressions as they passed: skepticism, amusement, the kind of resigned tolerance that suggested they viewed her assignment as a political gesture that would be corrected through practical experience. When the door closed, Martinez poured himself coffee from a carafe that had been sitting too long on the heating element. The bitter aroma filled the room like incense in a chapel dedicated to caffeine addiction. "They're good men," he said without looking at her. "The best I've ever worked with. But they're also products of a system that measures effectiveness in terms of confirmed kills and missions accomplished. Your background doesn't fit their definition of qualified." "I understand, sir, do you? Because what you're walking into tomorrow isn't a training exercise. These men have survived situations where the wrong decision meant death. They've earned their skepticism through experience that most people couldn't imagine." Martinez turned to face her, his weathered features showing the kind of fatigue that accumulated from years of making decisions where the stakes were measured in lives. "But you weren't assigned to this detail by accident. Someone with more stars on their collar than I have believes you bring capabilities this team needs." "What kind of capabilities?" "The kind that aren't listed in your official file. The kind that turned a domestic violence detective into someone who could make an impossible shot under impossible conditions and then go back to work the next day like nothing happened." Rebecca felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever someone mentioned the Vale incident. 3 years hadn't diminished the weight of that moment, the fraction of a second, where her decision had meant the difference between a little girl growing up and a family destroyed by violence. "That was different circumstances, sir. One target. Controlled environment, clear lines of fire, was it? Because the preliminary intelligence suggests we might be facing a situation where traditional tactics won't be sufficient. Where someone needs to see patterns that aren't obvious, make connections that aren't documented in tactical manuals." Martinez walked to the window, staring out at rain that showed no signs of stopping. "In 72 hours, 3 of America's most valuable military assets will be in the same room at the same time. If our intelligence is accurate, someone is planning to make sure they don't leave that room alive. My job is to make sure that doesn't happen, regardless of whether my methods conform to conventional wisdom. What do you need me to do?" "Survive the next 72 hours. Learn what you can from the team, but trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, speak up, regardless of how the others react. Sometimes the outsider sees what insiders miss." Rebecca nodded, understanding that she was being given permission to be exactly what the others would view as her greatest weakness, someone who didn't belong, who thought differently, who might ask questions that challenged assumptions nobody else would think to examine. "One more thing," Martinez added, his voice carrying the weight of experience earned in places where survival depended on understanding unspoken rules. "These men will test you. Not because they're cruel, but because they need to know what you're made of when everything goes wrong. Don't take it personally. Test how." Martinez's smile held the same quality as his coffee, bitter, but necessary. "For getting through the day, you'll find out tomorrow." As Rebecca left the briefing room, she carried with her the understanding that she was walking into a situation where failure wasn't measured in embarrassment or career setbacks, but in body bags and national security failures. The men she would be working with had every reason to doubt her qualifications, and the enemies they were facing possessed capabilities that remained frightening in their ambiguity. But she also carried something else, the memory of a 6-year-old girl whose life had depended on someone willing to take an impossible shot under impossible conditions. The knowledge that sometimes the most important battles were won not by following established procedures, but by someone willing to see what others missed. The rain continued to fall as she walked to her car, each drop carrying with it the weight of the next 72 hours. 3 generals, 1 summit, and an enemy whose identity remained hidden behind classified intelligence and fragmented communications. Tomorrow, she would begin learning whether her unusual qualifications would prove sufficient for keeping 3 of America's most important military leaders alive. Tonight, she would prepare for tests she couldn't anticipate from men who had every reason to want her to fail. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the margin for error didn't exist at all. The tactical training facility occupied 3 floors beneath the Pentagon, a labyrinth of shooting ranges, mock scenarios, and equipment rooms that existed in the classified space between theory and application. At 0630, Rebecca arrived to find the facility already humming with activity, the air thick with gun oil and the kind of competitive tension that emerged when elite operators gathered in confined spaces. She had spent the night reviewing personnel files, studying the backgrounds of men whose careers read like action movie scripts. Each had earned their position through documented excellence in situations where second place meant casualty reports. Their skepticism wasn't personal prejudice, but professional survival. Instinct refined through experiences where trusting the wrong person resulted in flag-draped coffins. The equipment room resembled a specialized armory, walls lined with weapons. Systems that ranged from standard-issue sidearms to exotic tools whose existence was acknowledged only in classified budgets. Rebecca examined the selection with the careful attention of someone who understood that her choice would be scrutinized for clues about her competence and experience. She selected a Glock 19 standard FBI issue, reliable and familiar. Around her, the other team members made choices that reflected their backgrounds and preferences. Peterson chose a customized 1911 that showed the wear patterns of extensive use. Williams hefted a Sig Sauer P226 with modifications that suggested personal familiarity earned through combat deployment. "Interesting choice," commented Captain Foster, noting Rebecca's selection. "Most people go for something with more stopping power when lives are on the line. Most people aren't comfortable enough with their marksmanship to trust accuracy." "Over firepower," Rebecca replied, checking the weapon's action with movements that spoke of muscle memory developed through repetition. Foster's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the kind of micro-change that indicated his initial assessment was being recalibrated. Around them, conversations paused as other team members registered the exchange, cataloging Rebecca's response for future reference. The first test came disguised as routine qualification. Master Sergeant Williams led them to Range 7, a specialized facility designed to simulate real-world protection scenarios. Targets appeared at random intervals and distances, requiring split-second decisions about threat assessment and appropriate response. "Standard qual course," Williams announced, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone conducting a routine exercise. 7 stages, progressive difficulty, passing score is 90%. What he didn't mention was that the course had been modified from its standard configuration. Distances were extended, timing compressed, and scenarios designed to stress decision-making under pressure. The kind of adjustments that would challenge experienced operators and potentially overwhelm someone whose background was domestic law enforcement. Peterson went first, moving through the course with fluid precision that demonstrated why former SEALs earned their reputations. His shots connected with mechanical consistency, his movement between positions economical and purposeful. 97%, a score that earned approving nods from the assembled observers. Foster followed, his FBI background evident in his methodical approach to threat assessment. He took fractionally longer to engage each target, but his accuracy was flawless. 95%, solid performance that confirmed his placement on the team. Williams completed the course with the kind of aggressive efficiency that marked his Delta Force background. His style emphasized speed over deliberation, trusting reflexes honed through combat experience. 94%, accomplished with commentary that suggested he could have done better if the stakes were real. The other team members performed with varying degrees of excellence, each demonstrating competency that justified their selection. For executive protection duty, scores ranged from 91 to 96%, a statistical cluster that indicated the course difficulty had been calibrated to challenge but not defeat experienced operators. Rebecca stepped to the starting position as conversations around the range took on the quality of spectators gathering for entertainment. She could feel their attention like physical weight, the collective assessment of men who had learned to read competence in the space between preparation and performance. The first stage presented multiple targets at varying distances, requiring rapid target acquisition and threat prioritization. Rebecca moved through the sequence with deliberate economy, her shots connecting with precision that earned surprised glances from the observers. Her movement between positions showed none of the hesitation typical of someone unfamiliar with tactical environments. Stage 2 introduced moving targets and partial concealment, scenarios designed to test adaptability under changing conditions. Rebecca adjusted her approach seamlessly, compensating for target movement and environmental factors with calculations that appeared intuitive but reflected deeper understanding of ballistics and timing. By stage 4, the conversations had stopped entirely. Rebecca's performance was exceeding expectations established by her personnel file, demonstrating capabilities that didn't align with her documented experience. Her shooting was precise without being showy, efficient without appearing mechanical. Stage 6 presented the course's most challenging scenario, multiple targets requiring engagement in specific sequence while under time pressure, simulating the kind of split-second decisions that determined whether protection details succeeded or failed. Rebecca completed the stage with a fluidity that suggested the pressure enhanced rather than hindered her performance. The final stage combined all previous elements into a comprehensive test of marksmanship, decision-making, and tactical movement. Rebecca finished with a score of 98%, a result that placed her at the top of the team's performance metrics. The silence that followed was broken by Williams clearing his throat with the deliberate authority of someone reasserting control over a situation that had deviated from expected parameters. Impressive shooting, Detective. Where did you develop those skills? Practice, Rebecca replied, her tone carrying the same neutrality she had used when testifying in court. Cases where her credibility was being challenged. Domestic violence cases require precision when lives are on the line. Peterson's pale eyes narrowed as he studied her with renewed interest. Domestic violence work doesn't typically involve that level of tactical movement. Your positioning showed familiarity with protective formations. I pay attention to detail. When someone's trying to kill the person you're protecting, you learn to think tactically. Foster stepped closer, his expression showing the kind of professional curiosity that emerged when established assumptions required revision. That was more than tactical thinking. Your shot placement showed compensation for factors that aren't typically encountered in law enforcement scenarios. Rebecca met his gaze with the steady composure she had developed through years of being questioned by defense attorneys, supervisors, and colleagues who viewed her methods with skepticism. Maybe law enforcement deals with more variables than people realize. The equipment test followed immediately, designed to assess familiarity with specialized gear used in executive protection operations. Body armor, communication systems, surveillance equipment, and tactical accessories that required training to operate effectively under stress. Rebecca approached each piece of equipment with the methodical attention she brought to crime scene analysis, examining function and operation with careful thoroughness. When asked to demonstrate radio protocols, she showed familiarity with terminology and procedures that extended beyond basic law enforcement training. "You've worked protective details before," Martinez observed, appearing at her shoulder as she adjusted a communications headset with practiced efficiency. "No, sir, but I've worked cases where communication failures meant someone died." "You learn to pay attention to the details that matter." The physical training evaluation revealed capabilities that again exceeded her documented background. Rebecca completed obstacle courses designed to test agility and endurance with performance that placed her in the upper tier of team results. Her approach emphasized efficiency over raw athleticism, demonstrating understanding of how to conserve energy while maintaining effectiveness. During hand-to-hand combat assessment, she partnered with Sergeant Kevin Murphy, former Marine, whose size advantage should have made the outcome predictable. Instead, Rebecca demonstrated defensive techniques that neutralized his strength advantages through positioning and leverage that spoke of formal training in systems not typically taught in police academies. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" Murphy asked after Rebecca had successfully countered his attempted takedown for the third consecutive time. "You pick things up when your job involves dealing with people who don't want to be arrested," she replied, but her technique showed refinement that suggested instruction beyond routine police defensive tactics. The psychological evaluation proved more challenging than the physical assessments. Dr. Elizabeth Harrison, the team's consulting psychologist, conducted individual interviews designed to assess stress response, decision-making capability, and psychological resilience under extreme pressure. "Your file indicates extensive experience with domestic violence cases," Dr. Harrison began, her tone carrying the professional neutrality that marked psychological assessment. "That work exposes officers to significant emotional stress. How do you manage that burden?" "You compartmentalize," Rebecca replied. "You focus on what you can control, accept what you can't, and remember that the work matters more than the cost." "Have you ever been required to use lethal force in the line of duty?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Rebecca's hesitation lasted barely a heartbeat, but Dr. Harrison's training allowed her to catch the micro-expression that suggested deeper complexity. "Yes. Can you describe the circumstances?" "Domestic violence incident escalated to hostage situation. Subject was threatening to kill a child. Clear and present danger, no alternative options available." "How did you handle the psychological aftermath?" "I focused on the fact that a little girl went home to her family because someone was willing to make a hard decision. That made the rest manageable." Dr. Harrison made notes with the careful precision of someone documenting observations that would influence life and death decisions. "Your psychological profile indicates unusual resilience. You've experienced traumatic situations without developing PTSD symptoms that would typically be expected. Maybe I process trauma differently than other people. Or maybe you've experienced more trauma than your file indicates, and you've developed coping mechanisms that aren't reflected in standard psychological assessments." Rebecca maintained eye contact with the steady composure that had served her well during cross-examination by defense attorneys who specialized in discrediting police testimony. "I deal with what's in front of me. The past is relevant only insofar as it prepares you for the future." The team-building exercise that afternoon was designed to assess group dynamics and individual response to stress under collaborative conditions. They were divided into pairs and given a scenario that required coordination, communication, and trust to complete successfully. Rebecca found herself partnered with Lieutenant Colonel Peterson, a pairing that felt deliberate rather than random. The scenario involved navigating a mock building layout while identifying threats, protecting a simulated VIP, and coordinating with other teams through radio communication. Peterson's approach emphasized aggressive movement and overwhelming response to potential threats. His military background showed in his preference for decisive action over cautious assessment. Rebecca's style proved more analytical, focusing on threat identification and risk mitigation rather than immediate engagement. "You're thinking too much," Peterson observed as they completed their second run through the scenario. "In real situations, hesitation gets people killed." "In real situations, mistakes get people killed too," Rebecca replied. "Sometimes taking a moment to assess prevents making decisions you can't take back. Analysis paralysis is a luxury we can't afford in executive." Protection. When the shooting starts, you act on instinct and training. When the shooting starts, someone has already failed at the primary mission, which is preventing the shooting from starting in the first place. Peterson stopped walking, his pale eyes focusing on Rebecca, with the kind of attention typically reserved for potential threats. "You think this is about prevention rather than response?" "I think protection is about seeing problems before they become crises. Response is what happens when protection fails." Their final run through the scenario reflected this philosophical difference. Peterson moved with military precision, treating each potential threat as an enemy to be neutralized. Rebecca approached the same situations as puzzles to be solved, looking for patterns and connections that might reveal the real threat among multiple possibilities. Their combined approach proved unexpectedly effective. Peterson's readiness to engage provided security against immediate threats, while Rebecca's analytical focus identified dangers that might have been overlooked in a purely reactive response. They completed the exercise with performance metrics that exceeded either individual capability. "Interesting partnership," Dr. Harrison observed as she reviewed their results. "Your different approaches complement each other rather than conflicting." "Different backgrounds, different perspectives," Peterson acknowledged, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the implications. The day's final evaluation involved a comprehensive scenario designed to simulate real-world protection challenges. 3 team members were designated as VIPs requiring escort through a multi-story building, while other team members played the roles of potential threats, innocent bystanders, and environmental obstacles. Rebecca found herself assigned to the protection detail, responsible for maintaining perimeter security, while the primary team moved their charges to safety. The scenario was designed to test communication, coordination, and decision-making under pressure that simulated combat conditions. What the scenario planners hadn't anticipated was Rebecca's ability to read the overall tactical situation from her position on the perimeter. While other team members focused on their immediate responsibilities, she maintained awareness of the broader pattern, tracking movement and communication that revealed the location and timing of planned threats. "Contact left, second floor window," she reported over radio, identifying a threat that hadn't yet engaged but was positioned to do so. "Negative contact visible," Williams responded from his position with the primary escort team. "Third window." From the north end, partially concealed behind interior wall. "Rifle barrel visible in shadow." Peterson, monitoring from the observation post, confirmed Rebecca's assessment through binoculars. Confirmed. Target acquired, threat neutralized. The exercise continued with Rebecca providing early warning for threats that other team members didn't identify until direct engagement became necessary. Her ability to read patterns and predict behavior proved as valuable as marksmanship or tactical movement. "How did you spot that last one?" Foster asked as the scenario concluded. "I was looking at the same building and saw nothing until he started shooting." "Behavioral patterns," Rebecca replied. "People move differently when they're hunting versus when they're just occupying space. You learn to read the difference. That's not standard police training either. Maybe standard training doesn't cover everything that matters." As the team gathered for debriefing, The dynamic had shifted in ways that weren't immediately obvious, but were felt by everyone present. Rebecca's performance had exceeded expectations established by her personnel file, demonstrating capabilities that raised questions about what else might be documented in classifications they couldn't access. "Outstanding work today," Martinez announced, his tone carrying approval that extended beyond diplomatic courtesy. All team members performed at levels that justified their selection for this mission. Peterson approached Rebecca as the group dispersed, his expression showing the kind of professional reassessment that emerged when initial judgments required revision. "You've got skills that aren't explained by domestic violence work," he said. Without preamble, "Where did you really learn to shoot like that?" Rebecca met his gaze with the steady composure that had carried her through the day's challenges. "I learned what I needed to learn to do my job effectively." That's not an answer. It's the only answer that matters. Peterson nodded slowly, understanding that he was being given the same kind of non-response that characterized classified briefings and need-to-know conversations. "Fair enough. But tomorrow we're going to find out what you're really made of." As Rebecca left the facility, she carried with her the knowledge that she had passed the day's tests, but had also revealed capabilities that would generate more questions and closer scrutiny. The men she would be working with were professionals who understood that survival depended on knowing the capabilities and limitations of everyone on the team. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, closer examination, and tests that would probe deeper into skills and knowledge that couldn't be explained by her official background. The stakes were rising with each passing hour, and the margin for maintaining her cover was diminishing with every demonstrated capability that exceeded her documented training. But she also carried something else, the growing confidence that she might be able to contribute more to this mission than anyone had anticipated, including herself. The protection of 3 generals might require exactly the kind of unconventional thinking that emerged from someone who didn't fit the standard mold of elite military operators. The rain had stopped, but storm clouds gathered on the horizon, suggesting that clear skies were temporary at best. The morning briefing carried an urgency that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier. Intelligence reports streamed across monitors mounted throughout the command center, painting a picture of accelerating threat indicators that transformed theoretical danger into imminent reality. Rebecca arrived to find the team already assembled, their faces reflecting the kind of focused tension that emerged when speculation became operational fact. Colonel Martinez stood before a wall-mounted display showing the Eisenhower Executive Office building in 3-dimensional detail, every entrance, exit, and structural vulnerability highlighted in colors that corresponded to threat probability. Assessments. Red zones indicated areas where attackers could establish positions with clear sight lines to target areas. Yellow marked potential escape routes and staging areas. Green showed defensive positions that offered tactical advantages to protection teams. The building resembled a security nightmare wrapped in historical architecture. Built in the 1870s, its design prioritized grandeur over defensive capability, creating dozens of vulnerabilities that modern threats could exploit with devastating effectiveness. Large windows offered excellent fields of fire for external shooters. Multiple entrances made perimeter control exponentially more complex. Interior layouts created choke points that could channel targets into predetermined killing zones. Intelligence indicates the attack will occur during the opening ceremony, Martinez announced, his voice carrying the weight of information that had arrived through channels requiring security clearances that existed above their operational level. All 3 generals will be present on the main platform for approximately 20 minutes, from 1400 to 1420 hours. Rebecca studied the tactical display with the analytical attention she brought to crime scene reconstruction, noting patterns and relationships that weren't immediately obvious. The ceremony's staging created a perfect kill zone from multiple angles, But it also created opportunities for defensive positioning that might not be apparent to attackers focused on target. Acquisition. "Sir," she said, raising her hand with the careful timing of someone who had learned that the wrong question could derail critical planning. "Has anyone considered that the ceremony itself might be designed to create this vulnerability?" The room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Peterson's pale eyes focused on Rebecca with the kind of attention typically reserved for subordinates who had just suggested that established doctrine might be flawed. "Explain," Martinez said, his tone neutral but interested. "The ceremony staging creates optimal conditions for the kind of attack we're expecting. Multiple sight lines, predictable target positioning, limited escape routes for the principals. If the enemy has detailed knowledge of our security protocols, they might have influenced the event planning to create exactly this scenario." Williams leaned forward in his chair, his scarred hands clasped together, with the kind of tension that suggested he was reconsidering assumptions he hadn't thought to question. "You're suggesting inside information?" "I'm suggesting that professional attackers with detailed knowledge of our procedures wouldn't leave target positioning to chance. They'd find ways to ensure optimal conditions for their operation." Foster pulled up the ceremony planning documents on his tablet, scrolling through details that had been approved through normal administrative channels weeks earlier. The platform positioning was specified by the event coordinator's office. "Standard protocol for Joint Chief Ceremonies." "Who has access to those protocols?" Rebecca asked. "Event planning staff, security coordinators, facility management, and anyone with appropriate clearance levels," Martinez replied, his expression showing the kind of concern that emerged when routine procedures revealed potential vulnerabilities. "How many people total?" "Approximately 40 to 50 individuals across multiple departments and agencies." Rebecca nodded, processing implications that created exponentially more complex security challenges. "So we're potentially dealing with an enemy who not only knows our defensive procedures, but might have influenced the conditions we're defending against." The silence that followed was broken by the arrival of General Patricia Hayes herself, whose unannounced appearance caused the assembled team to rise with the automatic discipline that marked military training. Hayes moved with the purposeful efficiency of someone accustomed to making decisions where delay meant strategic disadvantage, her presence transforming the briefing from planning session to operational reality. "Gentlemen, Detective Chen." Her acknowledgement carried the weight of someone who had reviewed classified files that painted a more complete picture than standard personnel records. "I trust the team is prepared for tomorrow's events." "Yes, ma'am," Martinez replied. "We're finalizing tactical deployments and response protocols." "Good, because the intelligence picture has become more urgent in the past 12 hours. Hayes activated the main display, revealing intercepts and analysis that painted a picture of coordination between multiple threat elements, whose capabilities remained frighteningly undefined. The communications intercepts showed fragments of planning discussions that indicated intimate knowledge of American security procedures, suggesting either extensive surveillance or access to classified information. Financial tracking revealed resource flows that supported complex operations, requiring significant advance planning and coordination. Most concerning were the intercepted references to the woman whose presence had apparently necessitated modifications to the original attack plan. Someone among the attacking force knew about Rebecca's assignment to the protection detail and considered her presence significant enough to alter established operational parameters. "They know about Detective Chun," General Hayes said without preamble, which raises questions about how they obtained that information and why they consider her assignment relevant to their planning. Rebecca felt the weight of every gaze in the room, the collective assessment of men who were suddenly viewing her not just as an unexpected team member but as a potential security breach whose very presence might have compromised the mission. "Ma'am," she said, maintaining the steady composure that had carried her through years of being questioned by people who viewed her methods with suspicion. I haven't discussed this assignment with anyone outside this room. My selection came through official channels. I'm sure it did. But the fact remains that someone with detailed knowledge of our operational security knows you're here and considers that information significant enough to modify their attack plans accordingly. Peterson cleared his throat with the diplomatic authority of someone redirecting a conversation that was veering into dangerous territory. General, perhaps Detective Chun's presence is exactly what we need. If the enemy is modifying their plans to account for her capabilities, they might be creating vulnerabilities we can exploit. Hayes studied Peterson with the kind of attention that suggested she was recalibrating her assessment of team dynamics and individual capabilities. What capabilities are you referring to, Lieutenant Colonel? Detective Chun has demonstrated marksmanship and tactical awareness that exceed her documented training. Her performance yesterday suggested experience that isn't reflected in her personnel file. The General's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the kind of micro-change that indicated access to information that others in the room didn't possess. I see. And what conclusions have you drawn from that observation? That Detective Chun brings capabilities to this team that we're still discovering, and that her assignment might be based on considerations beyond what we've been briefed on. Rebecca recognized the moment for what it was, a decision point where the truth might provide tactical advantage or create complications that could undermine the mission. She had spent 3 years living with the knowledge that her most relevant experience existed in classified files that painted a very different picture than her official background suggested. General, she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned that honesty was sometimes the only viable tactical option. There are aspects of my background that aren't reflected in standard personnel files. If those aspects are relevant to mission success, perhaps it's time for full disclosure. Hayes nodded slowly, her expression showing the kind of satisfaction that emerged when careful planning began to reveal its true dimensions. Colonel Martinez, please clear the room. Detective Chun and I need to have a conversation that requires higher classification levels. The team filed out with the disciplined movement of people accustomed to following orders they didn't understand, their expressions showing curiosity tempered by professional discretion. As the door closed, Hayes activated additional security protocols that ensured their conversation would remain protected from surveillance systems, both domestic and foreign. Rebecca Chun, Hayes began, settling into a chair with the authority of someone prepared to discuss information that existed in the spaces between official acknowledgement and operational necessity. Former FBI counterterrorism specialist, seconded to classified operations that don't appear in any personnel file accessible to this security clearance level. The relief Rebecca felt at having her real background acknowledged was tempered by the understanding that disclosure brought its own complications. For 3 years, she had lived with the weight of experiences that couldn't be discussed, skills that couldn't be explained, knowledge that existed in the classified shadows of national security operations. Yes, ma'am. Counterterrorism Task Force. Specialized in domestic cells with international connections. 7 operations, 6 successful interdictions, 1 that resulted in the death of a federal agent, Agent Maria Santos. Your partner and mentor. Killed during extraction from an operation. Targeting a cell planning attacks on military recruitment centers. The mention of Maria's name brought back memories that Rebecca had learned to compartmentalize but never eliminate. Maria had been more than a partner. She had been the agent who recognized Rebecca's unique combination of analytical ability and tactical skill, who had mentored her through the transition from local law enforcement to federal counterterrorism operations. Maria believed that the most effective agents were those who could think like both hunters and protectors. Rebecca said, her voice carrying emotions she rarely allowed herself to express. She taught me that saving lives sometimes required taking them, but that the goal was always preservation rather than destruction. And after her death, you requested transfer back to local law enforcement, domestic violence cases specifically. I needed to focus on protection rather than elimination. Maria died believing I could save more lives by preventing violence than by responding to it. Hayes nodded with the understanding of someone who had made similar transitions between roles that required different applications of the same fundamental skills. Your counterterrorism experience included advanced tactical training, specialized weapons proficiency, and psychological operations designed to understand and predict enemy behavior. Yes, ma'am. Multi-agency training at Quantico, advanced. Marksmanship at FBI facilities, tactical psychology courses that focused on behavioral analysis and threat prediction. Skills that would be extremely relevant to protecting high-value targets from sophisticated attacks planned by enemies with detailed knowledge of American security procedures. Rebecca understood that she was being offered the opportunity to acknowledge capabilities that her current assignment had been designed to utilize. Her selection for the protection detail hadn't been administrative error or diversity initiative, but tactical decision based on classified assessment of skills that conventional military training didn't provide. General, are you telling me that my assignment to this detail was based on my counterterrorism background rather than my law enforcement experience? I'm telling you that tomorrow's mission requires someone who can think like the enemy while protecting American interests. Someone who understands how terrorists plan operations and can anticipate approaches that conventional security thinking might miss. Hayes reactivated the tactical display, highlighting aspects of the building layout and ceremony staging that took on new significance when viewed through the lens of terrorist operational planning. The sightlines and positioning that created vulnerabilities for the protection detail also created opportunities for defensive positioning that anticipated rather than reacted to attack methods. Your team believes they're protecting 3 generals from an enemy whose capabilities remain undefined. The reality is more complex. The enemy knows exactly who they're facing and has planned accordingly. They know about Peterson's aggressive response preferences, Williams's Delta Force background, Foster's FBI tactical training. They've studied our people and developed countermeasures. But they don't know about my real background, precisely. They know Rebecca Chun, domestic violence detective with standard law enforcement training. They don't know about the federal agent who spent 2 years hunting cells that used American tactics against American targets. The implications were staggering. The entire protection detail had been configured not just to defend against attack, but to present the enemy with known capabilities that could be planned around while concealing the one asset that might provide tactical surprise. Ma'am, does the team know about this deception? Colonel Martinez knows. The others have been allowed to draw their own conclusions based on your demonstrated capabilities. Their skepticism and gradual acceptance provide authentic behavioral patterns that enemy surveillance would interpret as genuine rather than manufactured. Rebecca felt the weight of understanding settle over her like armor that was both protective and confining. She had been recruited not just for her skills but for her ability to maintain operational security while demonstrating capabilities that would appear to exceed her documented training. What do you need me to do tomorrow? What you've been trained to do. Think like a terrorist while protecting American lives. Anticipate approaches that conventional security thinking might miss. Be prepared to respond to threats that your teammates won't see coming. Hayes pulled up intelligence reports that painted a picture of the enemy's actual capabilities and intentions. The attacking force consisted of former military personnel with experience in asymmetric warfare, supported by technical specialists whose knowledge of American security procedures suggested either extensive surveillance or access to classified information. Their plan involved multiple elements designed to overwhelm conventional protection responses. Diversionary attacks would draw primary security resources away from the main target area. Electronic warfare capabilities would disrupt communications between protection teams. The primary assault would come from directions and angles that standard defensive positioning wouldn't adequately cover. They're not planning a conventional assassination, Hayes explained, manipulating the display to show attack vectors and timing sequences that revealed the operation's true scope. They're planning a demonstration. 3 dead generals, live broadcast. Maximum psychological impact on American military leadership. Broadcast to whom? Unknown. But the technical requirements suggest capability to reach military networks, government communication systems, and public media simultaneously. This isn't just about eliminating 3 individuals. It's about demonstrating that American military leadership is vulnerable despite our best protection efforts. Rebecca studied the intelligence with the analytical focus she had developed through years of tracking domestic cells whose operations required similar coordination between multiple elements. The planning showed sophistication that extended beyond simple assassination, suggesting objectives that encompassed psychological warfare and strategic messaging. General, this level of coordination requires resources and planning time that suggest state sponsorship or support from organizations with significant intelligence capabilities. Agreed. Which means the attackers have access to information about our procedures, personnel, and capabilities that goes beyond what civilian terrorists could obtain through surveillance alone. Inside information. Very likely. Which is why your real background has been compartmentalized to classification levels that limit access to essential personnel only. Hayes deactivated the displays and prepared to leave, her expression showing the kind of focused determination that marked senior officers preparing for operations where failure meant strategic consequences that extended beyond immediate casualties. Detective Chen, tomorrow you'll face a test that will determine whether 3 of America's most valuable military assets live or die. Your teammates are excellent operators, but they're thinking in terms of conventional threats and standard responses. You need to think like the enemy while protecting our people. Ma'am, what if the enemy knows about my real background? What if the intelligence about their knowledge of my assignment came from sources that have access to classified information? Hayes paused at the door, her expression showing the kind of concern that emerged when careful planning encountered variables that couldn't be controlled through operational security measures. Then tomorrow becomes a test of whether your capabilities exceed their countermeasures, whether the hunter can protect better than the hunted can attack. As the general left, Rebecca found herself alone with the weight of understanding that transformed her role from questioned team member to critical operational asset. Tomorrow's mission wasn't just about protecting 3 generals from assassination. It was about proving that American defensive capabilities could adapt faster than enemy attack planning. The team reassembled 30 minutes later, their expressions showing curiosity about the classified conversation that had excluded them from information relevant to their mission. Martinez provided a sanitized briefing that acknowledged enhanced threat assessment without revealing the specific intelligence about Rebecca's background or the enemy's detailed operational planning. Questions? Martinez asked as the briefing concluded. Peterson raised his hand with the careful timing of someone who had learned that the right question at the right moment could provide tactical advantage. Sir, should we modify our defensive positioning based on the enhanced threat assessment? Negative. We maintain standard protocols unless Detective Chen identifies specific vulnerabilities that require adjustment. Williams leaned forward with the intensity that marked his approach to operational planning. Are we dealing with military-trained opposition? Assume professional capability with detailed knowledge of our procedures. Plan accordingly. Foster's expression showed the kind of professional concern that emerged when incomplete information created planning challenges. Sir, are we authorized for lethal force without specific threat identification? Rules of engagement remain unchanged. Positive target identification required before engagement, but err on the side of protecting the principles. Rebecca listened to the exchange with growing understanding of how her teammates were processing incomplete information to develop tactical responses. Their questions revealed professional competence tempered by the frustration that came from operating without complete intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions. The remainder of the day was spent in final preparation activities that took on new urgency given the enhanced threat assessment. Equipment checks were conducted with the thoroughness of people who understood that mechanical failure during combat meant tactical disadvantage that could prove fatal. Communication protocols were rehearsed until coordination became automatic even under stress conditions that would challenge cognitive function. Rebecca found herself partnered with Peterson for final tactical rehearsals, their philosophical differences about aggressive response versus analytical assessment, creating a dynamic that proved unexpectedly effective. Peterson's military training provided immediate tactical capability, while Rebecca's counterterrorism background offered strategic thinking that anticipated enemy approaches. "You're thinking 3 moves ahead," Peterson observed as they completed a complex scenario involving multiple threat vectors and protection priorities. That's not standard law enforcement training. Maybe standard training doesn't prepare you for enemies who think strategically rather than reactively. Where did you learn to think like that? Rebecca met his gaze with the steady composure that had carried her through the day's revelations. You learn what you need to learn to keep people alive. As the team dispersed for final preparation activities, Rebecca carried with her the knowledge that tomorrow would test not just her individual capabilities, but her ability to integrate classified skills with a team that didn't know the full scope of what they were facing. The protection of 3 generals would require exactly the kind of thinking that existed at the intersection of law enforcement, counterterrorism, and tactical psychology. The enemy knew they were coming and had planned accordingly. Tomorrow would determine whether American defensive adaptation could exceed hostile operational planning, whether the protector could anticipate better than the attacker could plan. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the margin for error didn't exist at all. The morning of the Joint Chiefs Summit dawned with crystalline clarity that made every detail of the Washington skyline visible from miles away. Rebecca arrived at the Eisenhower Executive Office Building at 0530, 2 hours before the scheduled ceremony, to find the facility already buzzing with activity that transformed the historic structure into a fortress, wrapped in bureaucratic protocol. Security checkpoints had been established at every entrance, manned by agents whose expressions carried the focused intensity of people who understood that failure meant headlines no one wanted to write. Metal detectors, explosive detection systems, and biometric scanners created layers of verification that turned routine entry into a comprehensive assessment of every individual seeking access to the building. The command center occupied the 3rd floor, transformed overnight into a technological nerve center that monitored every camera, sensor, and communication channel within a 5-mile radius. Banks of monitors displayed feeds from surveillance systems that covered approach routes, interior corridors, and staging areas with the comprehensive coverage that left no blind spots for potential attackers to exploit. Rebecca studied the displays with the analytical attention she had developed through years of tracking threats that materialized in the spaces between visible activity and hidden intention. The ceremony staging area showed final preparation activities as technicians adjusted sound systems and positioned cameras that would broadcast the event to military installations worldwide. Colonel Martinez moved through the command center with the purposeful efficiency of someone coordinating multiple elements, whose successful integration would determine mission outcome. His weathered features showed the strain of commanding an operation where every decision carried consequences that extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. "Team leaders, final briefing in 5 minutes," he announced. his voice carrying across the controlled chaos of last-minute preparation activities, intelligence updates, and final positioning assignments. The briefing room had been configured for classified discussion, with electronic countermeasures that ensured their conversation would remain protected from surveillance systems, both domestic and foreign. As the team assembled, Rebecca noted how each member carried the focused tension that marked elite operators preparing for missions where theoretical planning would be tested against reality that refused to conform to careful predictions. Final intelligence confirms enhanced threat probability, Martinez began, activating displays that showed real-time information gathered through sources whose existence was acknowledged only in classification levels that exceeded their operational needs. Multiple indicators suggest coordinated attack elements positioning for action during the ceremony timeframe. The intelligence painted a picture of sophisticated opposition, whose capabilities had been refined through careful observation of American security procedures. Communication intercepts indicated knowledge of standard protection formations, response protocols, and the kind of tactical thinking that emerged from military training programs whose graduates now served in protection. Details across the government. Electronic warfare capabilities confirmed, Martinez continued, highlighting technical threats that could disrupt coordination between protection teams at the moment when communication became most critical. Expect communication jamming, surveillance, system interference, and possible disruption of emergency response coordination. Rebecca absorbed the information while maintaining mental maps of alternative communication methods and coordination protocols that didn't depend on electronic systems vulnerable to sophisticated interference. Her counter-terrorism training had emphasized redundancy and adaptation when primary systems failed under attack conditions. Sniper threat assessment remains high, Martinez announced, manipulating displays that showed sight lines and positioning opportunities surrounding the ceremony location. Multiple elevated positions provide clear fields of fire to the target area. Standard counter-sniper deployment has been enhanced with additional observation teams. Peterson studied the tactical display with the intensity of someone whose military experience had taught him to read terrain as a language that revealed both opportunity and danger. Sir, the positioning creates crossfire opportunities that could complicate response if multiple threats engage simultaneously. Acknowledged. Response priority is protection of principles, not engagement of attackers. Extract and evade rather than stand and fight unless extraction becomes impossible. Williams leaned forward with the kind of professional concern that emerged when established tactical doctrine encountered situations that required adaptation. Sir, if they know our extraction routes, standard evasion protocols might channel us into predetermined kill zones. Detective Chun, Martinez said, turning attention to Rebecca with the expectation that her analytical approach might provide perspectives that conventional military thinking could miss. Threat assessment from your viewpoint? Rebecca studied the displays while processing information through the lens of counter-terrorism training that emphasized understanding enemy psychology and operational planning. The attack elements showed coordination that suggested extensive advance planning, but they also revealed patterns that might indicate vulnerabilities in their own operational security. Sir, the coordination level suggests command and control elements that need to maintain communication with multiple attack teams. If we can identify their communication hub, we might be able to disrupt their coordination at the moment when they're most vulnerable to tactical surprise. Foster's expression showed the kind of professional interest that emerged when someone suggested approaches that extended beyond standard tactical responses. How do we identify communication centers in real time during active operations? Behavioral analysis. Command elements position themselves where they can observe the operational area while maintaining communication with dispersed teams. They'll be close enough to see results, but far enough away to avoid immediate tactical response. Martinez nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose careful selection of team members was proving tactically justified. Surveillance teams will focus on identifying observation posts that might serve command and control functions. The final equipment check revealed the kind of specialized gear that transformed theoretical preparation into operational reality. Body armor designed to defeat military-grade ammunition, communication systems that operated on encrypted frequencies resistant to jamming, and weapons whose selection reflected the balance between defensive capability and operational mobility. Rebecca examined her assigned rifle with the methodical attention she brought to any tool whose reliability might determine mission success. The weapon showed the careful maintenance that marked equipment prepared by professionals who understood that mechanical failure during combat created tactical disadvantages that could prove fatal. Custom modifications, Peterson observed, noting refinements to the weapon that suggested preparation specifically for her operational preferences. Someone's been paying attention to your shooting style. Good equipment makes good tactics possible, Rebecca replied. But her examination revealed modifications that could only have been made by someone with detailed knowledge of her preferred shooting techniques and the kind of precision requirements that emerged from counter-terrorism operations. The ceremony began with the precision timing that marked military events where protocol served both traditional and security purposes. General Hayes, General Thompson, and General Rodriguez took their positions on the main platform with the composed authority of senior officers whose careers had been built through decisions that shaped American military capability. Rebecca positioned herself at the designated Overwatch Station, a third-floor window that provided comprehensive observation of the ceremony area while maintaining fields of fire to critical approach routes. Her location had been selected to maximize both defensive capability and early warning potential for threats that might develop outside conventional sight lines. Through her scope, she could see the assembled audience of military personnel, government officials, and invited guests whose presence transformed the ceremony from routine protocol into a high-value target that justified the kind of sophisticated attack planning that intelligence indicators suggested. The first 15 minutes passed without incident, creating the kind of operational tension that emerged when careful preparation encountered reality that refused to conform to predicted timelines. Rebecca maintained her observation routine while monitoring radio communications that revealed the complex coordination required to protect 3 high-value targets in an environment that offered multiple opportunities for sophisticated attack. At 14:07 hours, Rebecca identified the first anomaly. A maintenance vehicle positioned near the building's east entrance showed movement patterns that didn't conform to scheduled service activities. The vehicle's occupants remained inside longer than typical maintenance calls required, and their positioning provided clear sight lines to the ceremony platform. Control, Overwatch 1, suspicious vehicle east entrance, maintenance company markings, occupants not conforming to normal service patterns. Roger, Overwatch 1, surveillance team deploying for closer observation. Rebecca continued her methodical scan of the operational area while maintaining awareness of the maintenance vehicle whose presence felt increasingly inconsistent with legitimate service activities. Her counter-terrorism training had emphasized the importance of trusting instincts that developed through experience with threats that materialized in seemingly routine activities. At 14:11 hours, the electronic warfare attack began with subtle disruption of communication systems that initially appeared to be technical malfunctions rather than hostile action. Radio communications became intermittent, surveillance cameras experienced periodic signal loss, and coordination between protection teams required increasingly complex workarounds. Communication degradation across all systems, came the report from the technical team. Appears to be broad-spectrum jamming with sophisticated frequency hopping to defeat countermeasures. Rebecca recognized the electronic attack as the preliminary phase of operations she had encountered during counter-terrorism missions where enemy forces used technical capabilities to create tactical advantages before physical assault began. The jamming pattern suggested coordination between multiple transmission sources, positioned to maximize disruption, while avoiding detection by standard electronic countermeasures. At 14:13 hours, Rebecca identified movement in 3 separate elevated positions that had been assessed as low-probability threat locations during advanced security planning. Figures appeared briefly at windows before disappearing behind interior cover, but their positioning created interlocking fields of fire that would allow coordinated engagement of the ceremony platform from multiple angles. Control. Overwatch. 1. Multiple contacts, elevated positions, buildings 7, 12, and 15. Coordinated positioning suggests sniper team deployment. The radio response was fragmented by jamming interference, but Rebecca caught enough to understand that counter-sniper teams were moving to engage the identified threats. However, her observation revealed additional movement that suggested the visible positions might be diversionary elements designed to draw defensive attention away from the primary attack. At 14:15 hours, Rebecca identified the real threat. Maintenance vehicle disgorged 4 individuals whose movement showed military coordination and purpose that had nothing to do with building maintenance. They carried equipment cases whose size and shape suggested weapon systems, and their approach to the building used tactical movement that indicated extensive training in assault operations. Control. Overwatch 1. Primary threat identified. East entrance, 4 military-trained individuals with weapons cases, moving to assault positions. The response was lost in electronic static, but Rebecca could see protection teams beginning to respond to threats they could identify while remaining unaware of the coordinated attack developing from multiple directions simultaneously. Enemy plan was unfolding with the precision that marked extensive advance planning and detailed knowledge of American defensive procedures. Rebecca faced the tactical decision that would define the mission's outcome. Standard protocol required her to maintain overwatch position while ground teams responded to identified threats. But her counter-terrorism experience revealed attack patterns that suggested the ground teams were being channeled into responses that would leave the principals vulnerable to the primary assault. At 14:16 hours, Rebecca abandoned her assigned position and moved to intercept the assault team whose approach would bring them within striking distance of the ceremony platform. In less than 3 minutes, her movement violated established protocol, but her analysis indicated that standard defensive responses were playing into enemy tactical planning. She reached the east entrance as the assault team completed their equipment preparation and began final approach to positions that would allow direct attack on the ceremony platform. Rebecca positioned herself in a maintenance corridor that provided concealment while offering clear sight lines to the assault team's planned route. The first attacker moved with the confident precision of someone following a carefully rehearsed plan, his weapon positioned for immediate engagement once he achieved line of sight to the target area. Rebecca's first shot struck him center mass, the suppressed report barely audible above the ambient noise of the ceremony proceedings. The second attacker reacted with trained efficiency, seeking cover while attempting to identify the source of hostile fire. Rebecca's position provided tactical advantage, but she knew that her window of opportunity was measured in seconds before the remaining team members adapted to the unexpected resistance. Her second shot eliminated the team leader, whose coordination role made him the priority target for disrupting the assault's effectiveness. The remaining 2 attackers found themselves facing defensive fire from an unexpected direction while their communication with command elements was disrupted by the same jamming that had been designed to hamper American coordination. The third attacker attempted to flank Rebecca's position while the fourth provided covering fire, their tactical movement showing the kind of professional competence that confirmed intelligence assessments about enemy capabilities. Rebecca adjusted her position to maintain defensive advantage, while the attack team struggled to adapt to resistance they hadn't anticipated. Her third shot neutralized the flanking attacker, leaving a single team member whose position had become untenable without support from eliminated teammates. The final attacker attempted to withdraw while maintaining defensive fire, but Rebecca's positioning prevented escape while offering him no tactical options for continuing the assault. Her fourth shot ended the immediate threat to the ceremony, but Rebecca knew that the assault team represented only one element of a coordinated attack whose other components might still be developing. She moved to secure the weapons and equipment the attackers had carried, seeking intelligence that might reveal the scope of the overall operation. The equipment cases contained military-grade weapon systems, whose specifications confirmed capabilities that would have proved devastating against protection teams equipped for conventional threats. Radio equipment showed sophisticated encryption and frequency management that explained the effective jamming of American communication systems. Control, Overwatch 1, primary assault team neutralized. 4 attackers eliminated, securing weapons and intelligence materials. The radio response was clearer now, suggesting that the jamming had been reduced with the elimination of the assault team's communication equipment. Roger, Overwatch 1, outstanding work. Return to Overwatch position for continued threat assessment. Rebecca moved back to her assigned station, while processing the tactical lessons that emerged from the successful defensive action. The enemy plan had been sophisticated and well coordinated, but it had been vulnerable to defensive actions that operated outside predicted response patterns. At 14:19 hours, with 1 minute remaining in the ceremony's scheduled duration, Rebecca identified additional movement that suggested backup attack elements positioning for secondary assault. The enemy had planned for the possibility that their primary attack might fail and had positioned additional resources to exploit any gaps in defensive coverage. Control, Overwatch 1, secondary threat elements identified. Multiple positions, appears to be backup assault capability. But this time, the defensive response was coordinated through communication systems that had been restored to full capability with the elimination of the primary jamming source. Counter-sniper teams engaged identified threats while ground teams moved to intercept assault elements before they could achieve effective positioning. The ceremony concluded at 14:20 hours with all 3 generals safe and unharmed. The assassination attempt defeated through coordinated defensive action that had successfully adapted to sophisticated enemy planning. Rebecca maintained her Overwatch position until formal all-clear signals confirmed that threat elements had been eliminated or captured. As the immediate tactical situation concluded, Rebecca found herself surrounded by team members whose expressions showed the kind of professional reassessment that emerged when established assumptions required fundamental revision. Her actions had saved the mission, but they had also revealed capabilities that couldn't be explained by any background documentation they had been allowed to access. "Outstanding shooting," Peterson said, his pale eyes showing respect that hadn't been present 48 hours earlier. "Where did you learn tactical movement like that?" "Experience," Rebecca replied, but her tone carried the weight of someone who understood that simple answers would no longer satisfy the questions her performance had generated. General Hayes appeared in the command center with the purposeful efficiency of someone whose careful planning had achieved its intended objectives. Her expression showed satisfaction that extended beyond successful mission completion to validation of strategic thinking that had operated on classification levels that remained beyond the team's access. "Exceptional work," Hayes announced, addressing the assembled team with the authority of someone whose assessment carried implications for future assignments and career development. The threat was neutralized through coordinated defensive action that exceeded enemy planning and capabilities. She turned to Rebecca with the kind of attention that suggested private conversation would follow formal debriefing activities. Detective Chun, your tactical innovation proved decisive. The enemy planned for conventional defensive responses, but didn't anticipate adaptation that operated outside established protocols. Martinez approached Rebecca as the formal debriefing concluded, his expression showing the kind of professional curiosity that emerged when successful operations revealed capabilities that hadn't been fully understood during planning phases. Your background includes training that isn't reflected in standard personnel files, he observed, but his tone suggested statement rather than question. My background includes whatever training was necessary to complete assigned missions, Rebecca replied, maintaining the operational security protocols that would protect classified information while acknowledging exceptional performance. As the team dispersed, Rebecca carried with her the knowledge that she had successfully completed a mission that tested not just individual capabilities, but her ability to integrate specialized skills with conventional protection procedures. The assassination attempt had been defeated through tactical thinking that combined counterterrorism experience with protective operations in ways that created defensive advantages the enemy hadn't anticipated. Peterson approached her as she prepared to leave the facility, his expression showing the kind of professional respect that was earned through demonstrated competence under conditions where failure meant strategic consequences. Whatever your real background is, he said quietly, you saved 3 lives today and probably prevented a strategic disaster that would have had consequences far beyond immediate casualties. Rebecca nodded, understanding that her performance had answered questions about capability, while generating new questions about the classification levels that protected her actual experience and training. The mission had been successful, but success had come at the cost of operational security that could never be fully restored. As she walked toward her car, Rebecca reflected on the weight of choices that had brought her from counter-terrorism operations through domestic violence, work to executive protection missions where her unique combination of skills had proved tactically decisive. The path had been marked by loss, learning, and the gradual understanding that protection work required thinking that operated at the intersection of multiple disciplines. The 3 generals were safe, the assassination plot had been defeated, and American military leadership would continue the work that had made them targets worthy of sophisticated attack planning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, and new opportunities to apply lessons learned through experiences that would remain classified long after their tactical implications had been absorbed into improved defensive procedures. The woman they had initially dismissed as too soft for protection work had proved that strength came in forms that couldn't be measured by conventional standards, and that the most effective defenders were sometimes those who thought differently enough to see threats that others missed. The test was over, but the mission of protection would continue as long as freedom required guardians willing to stand between those who would destroy and those who deserved to live. 6 months after the Joint Chiefs Summit, Rebecca sat in her Baltimore office reviewing case files that painted familiar pictures of domestic violence situations, requiring careful intervention and tactical precision. The fluorescent lights hummed with the same institutional persistence they had before her Pentagon assignment, and the stack of paperwork carried the same weight of lives, depending on someone making the right decisions at critical moments. But everything had changed in ways that weren't immediately visible to casual observation. The woman who had been dismissed as too soft for elite protection work now carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had proven that strength took forms that couldn't be measured by conventional standards. Her colleagues noticed subtle differences in her approach to dangerous situations, a heightened awareness that seemed to anticipate threats before they materialized into active danger. Detective Michael Torres knocked on her office door with the respectful authority of someone whose own experience had taught him to recognize competence when he encountered it. At 45, Torres had spent 20 years working Baltimore's most challenging precincts, building a reputation for street smart. Policing that earned respect from criminals and colleagues alike. "Rebecca, we've got a situation that requires your particular expertise," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk with the deliberate movement of someone whose back had been damaged by years of physical confrontations with suspects, who viewed police officers as obstacles to be overcome through violence. Domestic violence call? Domestic terrorism investigation. Federal task force is requesting local support for an operation targeting a cell that's been planning attacks on military recruitment centers. They specifically asked for you. Rebecca felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever her two worlds threatened to intersect in ways that could compromise the careful compartmentalization she had maintained since returning to local law enforcement. Her counterterrorism background remained classified at levels that prevented discussion, even with colleagues whose security clearances might otherwise justify disclosure. "Did they specify why they want me involved?" "They said you have experience with domestic cells that operate using military tactics against American targets. Also mentioned something about your analytical approach to threat assessment and behavioral pattern recognition." Rebecca nodded, understanding that her Pentagon assignment had generated recommendations that were filtering through federal agencies whose missions required the kind of specialized thinking that existed at the intersection of multiple disciplines. Her unique combination of skills was becoming known within communities that operated in the classified spaces between conventional law enforcement and national security operations. "When do they need an answer?" "Today. Operation launches tomorrow morning, and they want someone who can think like the targets while maintaining focus on protecting innocent lives." As Torres left her office, Rebecca reflected on the irony that her assignment to the protection detail had been designed to test whether her capabilities could adapt to challenges beyond her documented experience, and now that same adaptability was creating opportunities that extended far beyond what she had anticipated when she first requested transfer back to local law enforcement. Her phone rang with the distinctive tone that indicated calls routed through federal communication systems, designed to ensure secure discussion of classified information. The caller identification showed only a number that corresponded to FBI headquarters, but Rebecca recognized the voice that had become familiar through briefings and coordination meetings that followed successful operations. "Agent Patricia Kowalski, Counterterrorism Division." "Detective Chun, I trust Detective Torres briefed you on our request for operational support?" "Yes, ma'am. He mentioned a cell targeting military recruitment centers using tactics that suggest military training. Former Army personnel, discharged under circumstances that suggest psychological instability and grievances against military leadership. They've been planning coordinated attacks designed to maximize casualties among potential recruits and military personnel." Rebecca processed the information through analytical frameworks that had been refined through experiences with domestic cells whose operations required similar coordination between multiple elements and careful timing to achieve maximum psychological impact. The targeting suggested motivations that extended beyond simple anti-government sentiment to specific grievances against military institutions. "What's their operational timeline?" "Intelligence indicates attacks planned for this weekend when recruitment centers typically see highest civilian traffic. Multiple targets, coordinated timing, designed to overwhelm emergency response capabilities while maximizing media coverage." "How many cell members?" 5 confirmed, possibly more providing support functions. Former military training suggests tactical capability and knowledge of security procedures that could make conventional response ineffective. Rebecca understood that she was being recruited for an operation that would test her ability to apply lessons learned during the Pentagon assignment to situations that required different tactical approaches, but similar analytical thinking. The domestic cell represented threats that operated in the space between conventional criminal activity and terrorism that targeted American institutions. "Agent Kowalski, what specific role are you requesting?" "Tactical planning and threat Assessment. Your experience with domestic violence cases provides insight into psychological patterns that motivate violence against institutions and authority figures. Your other background. The pause suggested knowledge of classified information that couldn't be discussed over unsecured communication channels. Provides tactical understanding that could prove critical for anticipating approaches that conventional thinking might miss. Timeline for decision: immediate. Briefing starts at 0800 tomorrow. Operational deployment follows within 6 hours. Rebecca agreed to the assignment while understanding that each acceptance of federal task force requests was building a reputation that would generate additional opportunities and challenges that extended far beyond her original intention to focus on protecting victims of domestic violence. Her unique skills were becoming recognized within communities whose work protected American interests at levels that remained invisible to public awareness. The federal briefing facility occupied floors that didn't appear on building directories. Access through security protocols that ensured discussions would remain protected from surveillance systems, both domestic and foreign. Rebecca arrived to find herself working with agents whose backgrounds represented the intersection of military, special operations, federal law enforcement, and intelligence community expertise. The cell's planning showed sophistication that confirmed intelligence assessments about their capabilities and intentions. Military-grade weapons, detailed surveillance of target locations, and coordination protocols that suggested extensive advance planning and detailed knowledge of security procedures that protected recruitment centers from conventional threats. Their targeting pattern suggests specific grievances against military leadership rather than general anti-government sentiment. Rebecca observed during the tactical planning session. The recruitment centers represent military institutions that can be attacked without the security challenges that actual military installations would present. Agent Kowalski nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose request for specialized expertise was proving tactically justified. What approaches should we anticipate? Multiple simultaneous attacks designed to overwhelm response capabilities, possibly coordinated with diversionary activities that draw emergency resources away from primary targets. Former military training suggests they'll use tactical approaches that conventional security planning might not adequately address. The operation unfolded with precision that reflected careful coordination between multiple agencies, whose capabilities complemented each other in ways that created tactical advantages the cell hadn't anticipated. Rebecca's analytical approach to threat assessment provided early warning for attack methods that might have challenged conventional defensive responses. The cell was neutralized before their planned attacks could be executed, their weapons and explosives secured through tactical operations that prevented casualties among civilians or law enforcement personnel. The successful intervention saved lives while providing intelligence that revealed connections to other domestic extremist groups whose activities represented ongoing threats to American security. As Rebecca returned to Baltimore, she carried with her the understanding that her career had evolved beyond conventional law enforcement into something that operated at the intersection of multiple disciplines whose coordination was becoming increasingly important for protecting American interests from threats that couldn't be addressed through traditional approaches. Her phone displayed a text message from Colonel Martinez, whose words carried the weight of professional respect earned through demonstrated competence under extreme conditions. Outstanding work on the domestic cell operation. Your analytical approach is generating requests from agencies whose missions require exactly the kind of thinking you bring to complex problems. Rebecca understood that her path forward would continue to involve challenges that tested her ability to adapt specialized skills to situations that required thinking beyond conventional boundaries. The protection of American lives and institutions would require exactly the kind of interdisciplinary approach that emerged from someone whose experience spanned multiple communities dedicated to preventing violence rather than simply responding to it. The woman who had been initially dismissed as too soft for elite protection work had discovered that her greatest strength lay not in conforming to established expectations, but in bringing perspectives that challenged assumptions and revealed solutions that others might miss. Each assignment built capabilities that would serve future missions whose importance remained unmeasurable by conventional standards. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.